Great. Welcome and hello. My name is Mark Maloney. I'm the Vice Dean here at the Paris School of International Affairs. And I'm very pleased that you're all here to join us for this event entitled The West and the Global Implications of the Russia-Ukrainian War. Since the war began in Ukraine last February, SIA has organized or co-organized nearly a dozen events on different aspects. And at least half of those events have involved Ukrainian nationals on panels to hear that voice. We even, as some of you may know, coordinate a historic exchange between French university students more generally and the Ukraine President Zelensky, who joined us live from Kyiv on the 11th of May. And each of these events has proven extremely interesting, as I'm sure will be the case again today. Dear Professor Olexiy Haran, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Sciences Po and to PSIA. We're honored and delighted to have you with us today. For those who don't know, Professor Haran is a Professor of Comparative Politics at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, the UKMA, and he's also the founding director of its School for Policy Analysis. And I think it's worth noting that UKMA is one of only 13 institutions which hold the status of being a research autonomous university in Ukraine.
I may add
Please.
that Kyiv Mohyla Academy is the oldest university in Ukraine. It was founded in 1615. It was closed down when Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire, and it was reestablished in 1991. And our students are very active in all the revolutions.
Thank you. I love to have that additional point. Professor Haran himself, he's also the research director of the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, which is a leading Ukrainian analytical and sociological think tank, and I'm sure he can tell you a little bit more about that as well. He's the author of several books on Ukrainian public opinion and attitudes towards Europe and Russia, and he frequently comments on Ukrainian and international media. He also served for 15 years as a member of the Public Council under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. So this lecture has been organized with the support of JOINT, which is a collaborative research project on EU foreign and security policy that's part of the Horizon 2020 European Research Program, and we're delighted to co-brand with them on today's event. Professor Haran will speak for about 20-25 minutes or so, after which we'll jump straight into a question and answer session with all of you. So without further ado, Professor Haran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bonjour. Good afternoon. Вітаю. Добрий день in Russian. Salam alaikum. Shalom. Other languages needed? No? Because in every language you need to know how to say hello and how to thank you. So I know it from many languages. Well, I'm happy to be here, but definitely the time is difficult right now for my country, and I've just got the information on my telephone. You don't see it, but this is a red point, and it shows that now the alarm started in Kyiv. So because of Russian rockets, we don't know. So we know when the rockets are sent to Ukraine. We don't know where they will land. So we know just the direction. So in Kyiv there are many alarm clocks during the day. Public transportation stops. So it's very difficult to connect from the left bank to the right bank. The main shops are also closing for the alarm, and it may happen several times a day. Luckily, during recent days, Kyiv wasn't bombarded, but Kyiv was bombarded at the beginning of the war. So all my family, as many other Kyivites, they went to the shelters. My younger daughter evacuated to Vinnytsia, the place in right bank, Ukraine. She was bombarded there as well. She was evacuated to Lviv, on the border with Poland. She was bombarded there as well, so she has at this point post-traumatic syndrome. She's back to Kyiv right now, but we are all nervous, and you know why? Because we have these provocations at nuclear power plants, And we have this nuclear rattling by Putin, and Ukrainians, most of Ukrainians, they went through Chernobyl disaster, and we know what does it mean. So my family was evacuated during Chernobyl as well. So it's nervous situation, frankly speaking. But we will tell about it a little bit later. Now, for you to understand more, who am I always like personal stories because it explains a lot, much more than you can read in books, in the articles. And it will give also you understanding about Ukraine and what we call Ukrainian political nation. So I belong to Russified Ukrainians. You know that Ukraine for 300 centuries was Russified by Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. So my father was from Ukrainian village, he went to Kyiv, and in Kyiv he was Russified. So my native language is basically Russian language. So still I can read poetry better in Russian language than in Ukrainian. Many Ukrainians, they have, a mixture of ethnic origins, because this Ukraine was a place where many civilizations met. So I have also a tint of Jewish blood. I graduated from the main Ukrainian university in my time in the Soviet Union, and after that I couldn't speak Ukrainian freely. That's for you to understand. So I tried several times to switch to Ukrainian language, but it was impossible because the whole environment was Russian environment. And by the way, for you to understand, this is national Ukrainian shirt, which is called vyshivanka. So if during the Soviet Union you put this vyshivanka and you appear at the monument to great Ukrainian poet Shevchenko, one not football player, but writer, poet Shevchenko, who, and the monument is is very close to the university, at the entrance to the university. So if you appear in vyshivanka during the birthday of Shevchenko, it means that you are Ukrainian nationalist and you will be expelled from the university. So that's for you to understand in what situation we lived under the Soviet Union. So at that time, I believed in communist propaganda. I believe the West is bad. NATO is going to attack the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is a peace-loving country. Russians are our brothers. Ukrainian nationalists are crazy, horny guys who are enemies of the Ukrainian nation. So I believed in all this. I do not consider myself to be stupid, but I believed it. Why? Because Soviet Union was totally isolated and the Soviet propaganda dominated. There were no internet. We could read only one French newspaper. Guess what? L'Humanité. Oui, bien sûr. But what is interesting is that at that time in France, in French Communist Party, there was an ideological trend which was called Euro Communism, if you have ever heard about it. And sometimes they criticized the Soviet Union for violation of human rights. So if in Humanité you have this criticism of the Soviet Union, you cannot buy it. You couldn't buy it. Okay? So the Soviet society was isolated, so Soviet propaganda, worked, I would say, very, very well. And that's why now I understand what is the situation in Russia. Again, because they have TV-censored programs, they have only one official view, and you know what they are saying about Ukraine. So many Ukrainians, they have friends, not only friends, I would say relatives in Ukraine. I have a cousin who is living in Krasnodar, in Kuban, and he doesn't understand what's going on in Ukraine. When we said to him by phone call that we are bombarded in Kyiv, he asked me, "Who is bombarding you?" He didn't understand. When my mother said to him, "We are bombarded, Sasha, we are bombarded," he said, No, that's not the case. So imagine how Russian propaganda works, but there is an important difference compared to the Soviet Union. Now you have an internet. with all the limitations. You have the possibility to go on internet, okay, you don't believe Ukrainians, you don't believe the West, you see the videos on Al Jazeera, on TRT, on every other news, you have the videos of these bombed Ukrainian cities. So you can check and you may compare. But many Russians do not want, to do it, because psychologically it's not very comfortable, frankly speaking. And that's why, Russian society, that's important, Russian society, I would dare to say, is ill. They didn't protest en masse against the war in Ukraine, and they started to protest only when they are mobilized to the army. Oh, by the way, the war, when did the war start?
February 24th? 2014.
Any other ideas? Yes, 2014. The war started in 2014, and that's what we were trying to explain to our Western partners. Guys, we are attacked by Russians, by Russian regular forces. They are inside Ukraine. And many people in the West, they still, didn't believe us. Come on, you need to have dialogue with Russia. You have a civil conflict, even civil war. It was difficult for people here in the West to understand, and they bought the Russian propaganda. Okay, now let's talk about the evolution of the attitudes of Ukrainians. First of all, Ukrainians, since independence, Ukrainians wanted to have good relations both with Russia and the West. Very pragmatic, very pragmatic. Supporters of NATO in Ukraine, they were always in minority. Okay, we would like to be friends both with Russia and the West. What is the problem? So, we had free trade zone with Russia and the CIS countries. And at a certain point, Ukrainian authorities decided, okay, let's have free trade agreement with the EU. And it was part of the so-called association agreement. You know that it's possible for one country to have as many free trade zones as possible. And the official position of Putin was the following. We are against NATO, but if Ukraine would like to join the EU, okay, no problem. He believed that Ukrainians will not succeed in that. But when Ukraine was about to sign association agreement, not about accession, but about free trade zone, Putin said, no, you should join the customs union with Russia. And if you join the customs union, contrary to free trade zone, you can be a member of how many customs unions? One. So if you join customs union with Russia, you would not be able to have a free trade zone with the EU. So he put enormous pressure on then Ukrainian government, and Ukrainian president said, okay, we are postponing signing agreement with the EU. And when, because for several years in Ukraine, we were talking about, okay, we are going to sign, actual agreement was prepared, it was initialed. Do you understand the difference between initialed and signing? Okay, so it was initial, but officially it wasn't signed. So it was prepared, initial. But then there was a pressure on Ukraine. Ukrainian government said, oh, we postpone it. So students came to the street for this idea, of signing association agreement with the EU. Then they were brutally beaten, and what happened next day? The second Maidan. The first was in 2004, and this was in 2014. So Ukrainians immediately reacted. So when the students were beaten, it was clear there would be next Maidan in favor of European integration. First of all, that's why it's called Euro Maidan, but also they put demands to the authorities. There were several demands and they were radicalized, but nevertheless, again, what is important so it's not a NATO trick, no. as Russians are saying that this was a plot organized, by the way, by CIA. What is the French security service? How is it called? You're lucky, you don't know.
If you ask me
Security.
many other questions, I would know it, but not for France.
Mi-6.
My 6 is written.
Yes. And others. Okay, so it wasn't organized by the West. No, this was domestic protest. And what is important again, that it was non-violent for 2 months. Because now, we know these famous pictures from Maidan, with fire. And for 2 months, it was peaceful, non-violent. Non-violent, you see this non-violence. You see blessing in Maidan. This is my daughter, by the way. She was at school, pupil at that time. So it was very peaceful, joyful atmosphere. And again, it was non-violent. But what is even more important, look here. You see yellow and blue flags? Okay, Ukrainian flags. You see red and black flag? This is a flag of Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian insurgent army during World War II. Okay, understood? Now, what is the flag in the center? Russian. How could it appear in Maidan? Because there were Russians who were coming from Russia and who said that we are here to fight for your freedom and our freedom. Okay? And this is also the explanation, actually. Okay, so, and that's why Putin later intervened, because he was afraid that democratic Ukraine, effective Ukraine, and Ukraine which is integrated with the EU would be a danger for his own rule in Russia. So that's why he wanted to undermine both Ukrainian democracy and the whole Ukraine. And one more thing, this is very, very important. We are talking about Ukrainian political nation. It means it's not based on ethnicity. It doesn't matter what is your ethnicity. It doesn't matter what is your language. And it doesn't matter what is your confession. How can you define that you are Ukrainian? You live here, you love this country, you consider it as a motherland, and you are going to defend this country. So the notion of Ukrainian political nation, you have this notion in the West, okay? But that's the important thing that Putin and other people in Kremlin never understood. I would say that Russian elites, they never understood what Ukraine is. Because for them, Ukrainians, they're younger brothers. No, why younger? Ukrainians are older historically than Russians, and Kyiv is 500 years older than Moscow at least. But they called us younger brothers, and they said, in Russian Empire, they said, there's no separate nation as Ukrainian. Ukrainian language was banned from the public use in the Russian Empire. And what Mr. Putin is saying right now? He's saying basically there are no Ukrainians as a separate nations. You are one nation with Russians. And Putin thought that if many Ukrainians are speaking Russian language, and basically all of Ukrainians are bilingual, okay? All are bilingual. So, but if Russian language is spoken in the south and east of the country, it means that these Ukrainians would be happy to join Russia. And this was craziness. So basically, okay. So when he started invasion in Ukraine in 2014, he thought that it's not supported by Ukrainians, because there were many volunteers who were going to the front line and who were speaking Russian language. Many of them were from Donbass, and they were saying in Russian Мы защищаем украинский Донбасс от Путина. I'm saying in Russian. So we are defending Ukrainian Donbas from Putin. But they were saying it in the Russian language. So, what Putin did first, and it had huge repercussion on international relations, because I promised to talk about, how is it called? Global consequences, right? So now we have global consequences. So, Crimea's annexation, first annexation in Europe since World War II. First. Kosovo, Northern Cyprus do not count for annexation. And what is really important, 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union. And it was the third largest arsenal in the world. British, French, Chinese combined together. So we gave it up in exchange for the guarantees on the paper of territorial integrity of Ukraine, which was provided by US, UK, and Russia. So what happened in 2014? Russia violated it. So, and it was a clear sign, as well as many other agreements signed with Ukraine, because Russia recognized territorial integrity of Ukraine, territorial borders. And it was a clear sign to all those who have nuclear weapons in the world, or those nations which are striving to get nuclear weapons. Don't give up nuclear weapons, because otherwise you could be attacked. There are no guarantees, international treaties. No. So that's why definitely it was huge blow to non-proliferation regime. Now, what happened in Crimea, and then Putin intervened in Donbass with regular forces. You see, before 2014, red line, Ukrainians were in favor of union with Russia and Belarus. So Ukrainians did have, before 2014, very, maybe unrealistic, maybe naive, I would say, but at the same time, from the natural logic. Okay, we are here in Ukraine, we would like to be friends. Would you like to join the European Union? Yes. Would you like to join the union with Russia and Belarus? Yes. So we would like to be friends with everybody. After 2014, the whole belief to union with Russia collapsed. People started to say no. But what is even more interesting, this is about NATO. So let me show. So this is non-bloc, support for non-bloc. Okay? This is support for NATO. So as I have said to you, before 2014, supporters of NATO like me, we were in minority. Most people said, okay, why should we join NATO? Let's be non-bloc. Let's be friends with everybody. So most people were in favor of non-bloc. Right after 2014, the whole situation changed, naturally. Ukraine was attacked, and the support for NATO skyrocketed. So when Mr. Putin is saying that I had to intervene in Ukraine because NATO was moving into Ukraine, trying to create threats to Russia, this is a bluff. Ukrainians didn't want it. Official status of Ukraine was non-bloc. However, when Putin intervened, it all changed. Very naturally. Okay. And that's what happened this is Russian map, by the way. You see, Crimea is not in the colors of Ukraine. Crimea is already annexed. And Russia moved into Donbass. First, covertly. Okay, so they didn't send regular forces, they sent so-called tourists, and you can easily recognize the tourists. Oh, by the way, do you know whom I met on my flight from Warsaw to Paris? Russian mercenaries.
Really?
Yes. It was, first of all, I listened to them, then I saw these guys, no intellectual, So they were mercenaries, and then I saw, the tickets. So the ticket was to Niger. So they were flying they boarded in Warsaw, and they were flying through Paris to Niger. This is an interesting question to security services, and all these things. But, so there were Russian tourists in Donbass in 2014, but it was covert operation. Some of them were openly, they were saying we are Russian citizens, but when were trying, to compete with Ukrainian army and with volunteers, so it's very important, volunteer battalions at that time, because Ukrainian army wasn't ready for that. They appeared on the verge of collapse, and you may see this. Okay, so look at the map. Is it civil war? No. Civil conflict, maybe. But then Putin decided to intervene, and he moved the regular forces. And in violation of several agreements, so-called Minsk agreements, they were expanding. So these territories were occupied in red, and they were directly controlled by Russia. So this is a map of Donbass, but even with the support of the regular army, Russians had control only over 1/3 of Donbass. 2/3 of Donbass remained under Ukrainian control. And at that time we were trying to explain to the West, look, we have Russian aggression, we have war, give us weapons, increase sanctions. And the West was very, very slow and reluctant. Yes, the West introduced sanctions, especially after the tragedy with MH17, which was shot down by the Russian missile civilian aircraft. But generally speaking, this wasn't enough. And we Ukrainians, we were asking the West, do more sanctions. Putin is preparing for the new war. Give us weapons. Give us weapons. Only in 2016 we received first javelins from the United States. But support wasn't enough. And we saw the increase of Russian forces around Ukraine, and we were asking, look, we are moving to the war. Putin would attack sooner or later. And again, in the West, there was still belief that we need to take Russian legitimate security concerns. We need to have dialogue with Russia. We need to have shuttle diplomacy. And it didn't prevent Putin from aggression. So when you appease aggressor, it will not lead to good things. We know it from history. We know it from Munich Agreement of 1938. But somehow politicians in Europe, they didn't take it into account. They were thinking, okay, Putin is rational, it's counterproductive to Russian national interests, and it is counterproductive to Russian national interests. It is. But Putin behaved in this way. Partially it's explained by, first of all, his obsession with Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't exist. This is part of Russia. And secondly, he believed that in 2-3 days, I will seize Kyiv. And the same was believed in many European capitals. This in 2-3 days, Ukraine will collapse. So believe me, I'm moving. Believe me that first days of Russian aggression, and I live in Kyiv at the north, Abalony, which is 15 kilometers from the front line. It was very, very nervous because Russians were sending diversions directly to Kyiv. So, first 2 days, very nervous. And I went to the street, the military registration point, so old professor decided to take an arm, to take a gun. And I failed. Why? Because when I went to military registration point, there was a line. huge line of people staying, civilians, old and young, and they were staying to get arms, Russian speakers. And at that time, I understand that Putin will fail. Basically, he failed from the very beginning. So he attacked Ukraine, he revealed his face of aggressor, and Ukrainians mobilized again, because even those who believed in the so-called Ruski Mir, Russian world, they were bombarded. If you see the videos from the cities of Mariupol or Kharkiv, which mostly are Russian-speaking cities, they're all bombarded like Aleppo. So, and Russian speakers had to escape from Ruski Mir. So that's why Putin lost from the very beginning. And you see, this is a vote which in the UN of denouncing Russian aggression. Green, 141 countries voted denouncing Russian aggression. 5 countries, actually 4 countries supported Russia. Northern Korea, Syria, Eritrea, and
Venezuela.
No. And Belarus. Venezuela supported in 2014, didn't denounce. But now only 4 countries, Eritrea, Northern Korea, Syria, and Belarus. So total isolation of Russia. The third world actually divided. So you see that many countries, Brazil, Indonesia, they also denounced Russian aggressions, but a lot of countries abstained. And now let me talk about some global consequences, and I will finish with that. So what Russian aggression showed? Russian army is corrupt. Russian army is not effective. Russian weapons are worse than the Western weapons, and this is very important because one of the tools of Russia in the Third World to sell weapons, Russian weapons, to many countries. And it appears that actually Russian weapons are not good enough. Now, Russia was viewed as a security guarantor in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, in the Caucasus, and now it appears that Russia is not a security guarantor. If you look at the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, they're not peacekeepers. And actually, Russia wasn't supported even by the countries of the so-called Russia-led Organization for Collective Security Treaty. Okay, no country supported, except for Belarus. And Russia was asking, send us symbolic military units, symbolic. And even Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, they refused to do it. Okay, now, food crisis. Okay, so you have a serious food crisis because of Russia's support, or because the export of Ukrainian grain is blocked by Russia. Very cynically, Russia is trying to blame Ukraine for that. Come on, you are bombing the ports, you are blocking the waste, and they are saying, okay, Ukraine is good. So now, luckily, we have this agreement for export of grain, but it's very, I would say, cynical. And so on the one hand, it's allowed for Ukraine to export grain, but on the other hand, Russians continue to bombarding Ukrainian ports, Ukrainian cities. You know that, again, Russia is saying NATO is fighting us. We asked NATO to provide no-fly zones. NATO refused. Because NATO do not want to be involved directly in the conflict. So now we are asking, give us anti-air defense, air defense system, anti-missile system. Because Russian tactics now is very, very simple. They're just, they're destroying Ukrainian cities. And targeting civilians, targeting nuclear power plants. You have a nuclear threat. Look, imagine if something happens, even not nuclear, the use of nuclear weapon, but if there's an accident in the nuclear power station, what would happen with the food? It would be contaminated. And by the way, never ever in history, never ever, nuclear power station was seized by the foreign power. If you don't believe me, check on Google. Google knows everything. So it's first time, for the first time, foreign powers is seizing nuclear power station. And finally, you have humanitarian catastrophe, because Ukraine has about 36 million, up to 40, 20 million left their places. Oh, no, not 20, sorry, 12 million. So basically 1/3. Every third Ukrainian left his place, either to Europe or within Ukraine becoming an IDP. So this is huge humanitarian catastrophe, but this also increases the problems for the third world, because now Europe promised to receive some Afghan migrants or some migrants from Africa. Now it's impossible, because there's no other way for Ukrainians to go. Look at the map, where to go? Only to Europe. So all this, definitely this war has the consequences for the whole global security. And we see now even the changes in position of such countries, I believe, as China and India, who are now talking more about territorial integrity of Ukraine. Why many third world countries didn't denounce Russia? First of all, because of these ties with Russia, economy, energy, weapons, dictators who are friends with dictator. But also the third world countries viewed it in the paradigm of the Cold War. There is Russia / the Soviet Union and the West. And they're fighting. Now they're fighting for Ukraine. It's not our fight. So it's very important to understand. We are fighting for ourselves. There are no NATO bases in Ukraine. There are no NATO soldiers in Ukraine. We are fighting ourselves. So give us weapons. So we still are asking the West for that. So the Western reaction is positive, but slow. And one more thing, I should praise the EU that we received the candidate status. It's very important. First, symbolic point of view, Ursula von der Leyen said that Ukraine, is one of ours. Very important message, and this will be also a tool for democratic transformation of Ukraine. So I will stop here. It's still alarm in Kyiv. Okay, and I will inform you when it will end. I receive it on my mobile. And so I'm sent, what is a victory for Ukrainians? If you ask me, I will tell. And thanks very much again for joining consortium of European think tanks, also one Indonesian think tank and Ethiopian think tanks, which I included. We met in Paris. They helped to organize this lecture, and many thanks to the organizers. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Olexiy. So as promised, we still have 45 minutes or so for questions and answers. I think there's a roaming mic which will come around. So if you have a question, please just lift your arm, and we'll get the mic to you, and we can start the Q&A session right away.
You may put provocative questions. I'm fine with it. You know, I like questions. I like to answer, and I like to explain to the world what is Ukraine and what Ukrainians are fighting for.
So maybe while you're thinking of your questions, I'll start with a question. In that we've seen in the last few days that Putin has decided to increase the number of soldiers at the availability for this war, including, of course, those who come from within Ukraine. What he now considers to be annexed territories, or soon to be annexed territories. I'm not exactly sure where they are in the process, but also too from other minority ethnic groups. They seem to be disadvantaged. And maybe your comments on the likelihood. Obviously, we've heard President Zelensky's message, which of course is to discourage Ukrainians from being involved in any of these processes, to tell Russian soldiers that if they're at all hesitant about the rationale behind it, that if they, as it were, give themselves up, that the Ukrainians will help them. But what is your sort of view about the likely success that Putin will have by this call-up?
Okay, I'm not a military analyst. What I read from the military analysts is that this mobilization will not be effective. If we're talking about mobilization of Ukrainians from the occupied territories, look, Ukrainians do not want to fight for Putin. So you may easily check the Google how Ukrainians met Russian soldiers in Kherson or other places by demonstrations. Demonstrators, manifestations with Ukrainian flags, so unarmed people against armed people. So this was a real expression of the views of Ukrainians. And if you're talking about Russia, actually what's happening right now was predicted by many. So they said Putin is not announcing mobilization because he is afraid of reactions from Russia. One thing is to sit on television and say, oh, get down this Ukrainian nationalists. And the other thing, you know, when you are mobilized, to take arm and go to the front line. Totally different. And you see how Russians are now voting. They are voting by their legs, trying to escape the country. So I think now we see protests. They are not massive, but we see some protests. We see some military registration points in Russia which are put on fire, actually. We see also protests in some communities. And look, what Putin tried to do since the beginning of, we call it full-scale war. So the war since 2014, February 24th, is full-scale war. Putin tried not to mobilize people from the central Russia and especially Moscow, St. Petersburg, for obvious reasons. So basically he was trying to mobilize people from Siberia and from ethnic minorities regions, like Caucasus, like Buryatia, like Tver, and some others, because these are depressed regions, simply, depressed regions. And yes, some volunteered to go to sign a contract and to go to fight. So that's why the number of the killed is Russians is disproportionately high for ethnic minorities, and from the people from depressed regions. So I think at the end of the day it will increase domestic tension with Russia. To what extent, we don't know. Because Putin still has control over law enforcement forces, over the army, but definitely the tension within Russia will increase. Some people are talking about that Russian Federation will collapse. I don't know. It's difficult. It's very difficult to predict. You know, nobody predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then there was a trigger, like coup d'etat, and this coup d'etat failed, and the Soviet Union collapsed. So we don't know what will happen in Russia. For Ukrainians, okay, we continue to fight. That's our own. That's the only thing we can do. We continue to fight, and we are asking for defensive weapons, and we are asking for offensive weapons, but not to attack Russia. We do not have the aim to attack Russia. We need to liberate our territory. And it's very bloody. Some of my former students, they died. They volunteered and they died.
Questions, please. Here's one. Yes, it's better because we're recording it.
Okay. So this is maybe a bit of a premature question.
So maybe I should just say, if you could just quickly introduce yourself, your nationality, if you're prepared to share that with us, and what you're studying here at Stanford.
But it's not necessary. It could be anonymous.
Absolutely.
I'm Emma, and I'm from Austria, and I'm studying international economic policy. And yeah, my question is that this war can't really go on forever, so in a way it has to stop at some point. possibly for the signing of a peace treaty. And there is understandably now a lot of dislike and hate from Ukrainians towards Russia and also the Russian population. And I wanted, like, a sort of a catchphrase is that I heard someone say, I do not want to live in a world where Russia still exists. So I wanted to know what you would think would need to be included in a sort of peace treaty or in the end of the war that would calm down the situation also in the Ukrainian population.
Look, first of all, Ukrainians are not bloodthirsty. We are not going, to kill Russians. What Russian soldiers are doing is in Ukraine, they're doing crazy, brutal war crimes. Okay, let me go to the polls, right? Because polls will show more, and this slide actually I wanted to show to you, but didn't show. So you see that more than 90% believe in Ukrainian victory. Okay? Now, this next question was, how would you define Ukrainian victory? So 55% would say that this is the restoration of territorial integrity. Okay? So, and this is official position of Ukrainian government. We are fighting for liberation of Ukrainian territory. Okay? This is a dominant point of view. Additionally, how much? 21% would like to see the defeat of the Russian army and impetus for the solution or split of Russia. 20%. Again, this is a radical view. I don't know, I have already said, I don't know if to what extent it's realistic, but about 20% of Ukrainians, they think if Russia remains imperial, it would be an existential threat to Ukraine forever. But you see that this is still, it's minority, of the view. So I can understand. For me, it's important. Look, I'm not a Russian citizen to decide what kind of Russia would be. It's for Russians to decide. And when I'm saying for Russians, I include also national minorities, ethnic minorities. It's for them to decide whether they would like to live within Russian Federation, which is not federation at all, or not. Okay? So that's what Ukrainians think about it. But again, we are not, please understand, we are not against Russians as Russians, because if you read Russian propaganda, basically it means kill Ukrainians. Those who speak Ukrainian language, those who stick to Ukrainian viewpoints, outlook. This is not the case. Again, within Ukraine there are many ethnic Russians who are fighting for Ukraine. And you need to understand that ethnic Russia, who is Russian, who is living in Ukraine, is different from Russian who is living in Russia. So ethnic Russians who are living in Ukraine, they know Ukrainian language, they know Ukrainian culture, they are fans for Ukrainian football clubs, and so on and so forth. So, okay. But Russians who are living with Russia, mostly, and I gave example of our relatives, they do not understand. They may be ethnic Ukrainians who are living in Russia, but they are Russified to such an extent that they buy all the things that Russian propaganda is suggesting.
So 2 hands, right? Immediately here, one and then right behind. We'll take them together and then...
Wait, is it working? Yeah.
And one more thing, it's very important. Look, Russian language, and Russian culture. As I said, we are bilingual, so we know Russian culture. Now there is a natural process of derussification. It's from below, because even people who are speaking Russian language, and before coming here 2 weeks ago, I was at the front line with humanitarian support, and also asking soldiers directly in trenches. And many soldiers, they were trying to, I was asking in Ukrainian, so they were trying to respond in Ukrainian, but with difficulties. And they said, speak Russian. And they said, no. We decided to gradually move to Ukrainian language. But Russian language will continue to exist. No problem about it. in Kyiv, if you're in Kyiv, Mr. Lavrov is saying that everybody who's speaking Russian language in the streets of Kyiv is bitter. Come on. This is so crazy. So Russian language will remain, and Russian culture will remain. Now we have changes in our curriculums. For example, because previously, the whole foreign literature was composed of Russian writers. So now some of them are removed. Instead of Pushkin, we will study Byron, Goethe, Molière, and so on and so forth. Who will remain in the program, school program? Interesting, Bulgakov, Собачье сердце, the dog's heart. Bulgakov is actually anti-Ukrainian, but one of his piece is included in the program. Then Gogol, and some others. I would also keep Chekhov, but we'll see what will happen.
Hi, I'm Hannah, I'm from the UK. I study international security. My question is, so the results of the Italian elections last night and the election of Meloni, who's from the far right, I wondered if you think that this could change the level of European EU solidarity with Ukraine, and if that could affect the way things go in that sense.
Do we have Italians in the room?
Yes, we do.
So they may better comment on that. We'll see. Look, we know that the right in Italy usually they were on a good terms with Putin. Regarding Meloni, she actually is in favor of continuing support to Ukraine. And what I heard from Italian experts, they said if it happened, say 3 years ago, then the situation would be much more dramatic. Now they modified their position, but again, I'm not look, for us, for Ukrainians, we continue what we can do. That's all. We continue. Whatever is the situation in every specific European country, whatever are the results of elections, we continue to fight. We don't have any other option. So we'll see very soon.
We'll try to have an event soon to think about. In fact, I think there was one on Friday in advance of the Italian elections, and no doubt there will be something coming up soon to talk about some of the implications more broadly, obviously, in respect of does this create an implication for EU solidarity on specific questions? So, please.
Hello, my name is Rodrigo. I'm from Mexico. I study also international security. And my question has to do also with my country, because a lot of countries that are not in the Anglo-Saxon world or not in Europe, especially in Africa and Latin America, have different views to this.
Mexico is good.
Yeah. but for example, Africa still has a lot of security agreements with Russia and it still has the Wagner troop presence. So my question is how they should be responding, how they should view Russian aggression, especially with this colonial legacy that some of these countries have. Yeah.
Look, yes, thank you. Muchas gracias. Look, that's what I was saying, that many third world countries, they still view Russia as a successor to the country which supported anti-colonial struggle, to the Soviet Union. And that's why they're sympathetic towards Russia. So this is ideological explanation. There are different other explanations which I mentioned. Regarding it, it's necessary to keep in mind that the Soviet Union was also an empire. It was an empire, but it was very sophisticated empire. So, from formal point of view, Ukrainian language wasn't banned. From formal point of view, we had a sovereign state. We had the right to, in the constitution, we had the right to leave the Soviet Union. But there was a Ukrainian dissident whose name is Lukyanenko, and he was a lawyer, and in 1961, he started to advocate for Ukraine to leave the Soviet Union. According to the constitution, he was arrested, he was sentenced to death. Then he was spared, but he spent 26 years in the camps and prison. 26 years. So it was on the paper. In reality, it was totally different. It was controlled from Moscow. But at that time, they used some sophisticated tools. One of the most sophisticated tools was Russification. Russification, and we are friends. We are brothers. We are brothers. We have joint origin of Kyiv state, so we are brothers. But in reality, it led to gradual Russification. I will give you an example, because I think it's important for you to understand how the Soviet Union worked, because you never lived in the Soviet Union. And when people didn't live under communist rule, they liked the ideas, be equal, be against bourgeoisie. Imagine there are no countries, imagine no possessions, it's easy as if you can, no need for hunger, brotherhood of men, and so on and so forth. So people arrived to the lecture, I'm the lecturer, first lecture, and there are different people, because it's Kyiv. So there are students not only from Ukraine, there are students also from other parts of the Soviet Union, and also the children of the military. Militaries, they were transferred all over the country, who arrived to Ukraine recently. So I'm coming to the audience, and I'm saying, guys, I can deliver a lecture in Ukrainian or Russian. If there's anybody in the room who doesn't understand Ukrainian, several people will raise their hand. So I will continue in Russian. That's how it was done in the Soviet Union, Russification problem. So the Soviet Union was empire, and now the Russian Federation is also smaller, but it's also empire, it's dictatorship. So for the third world country, you need just to watch and see and try to understand what was going on, why the Soviet Union supported the third world countries. They used them as a card, in the fight with the West, and in the fight for the whole so-called brighter world, which meant communist world. But if you talk to those people who served in the Soviet army and who participated in military conflict in Chad, in Afghanistan, in many other places, you hear the cruelties, what the Soviets did there. So this is from ideological point of view. By the way, India, India actually enjoyed cheap prices for oil and cheaper prices for arms. So India is very, very, very cautious here. And that's what I never understood. Because when I was talking to Indians, look, guys, you were fighting for freedoms. You were fighting for national independence. You are fighting with terrorism. You are fighting with separatism. Why do you basically support Russia? Officially, they didn't support Russia. Why don't you support Ukraine? Because now we face the same problem. We are fighting for our existence. By the way, one Russian propagandist, it's official, it's on Kremlin website. It was written, the aim, de-Ukrainianize Ukraine. It's even translated into English. Very, very good. So you can read it. You can read it yourself. De-Ukrainianize Ukraine. Divide Ukraine. Many states with no name Ukraine in the title. It's on official Kremlin site. So this is about ideology. The other things which I mentioned, food, economy, energy prices. So it all other blows to the third world countries. But Russian propaganda is very effective. They're spending huge resources. And what they're doing, they're destabilizing the countries in Africa, So Russia is not strong militarily, not strong economically. So how can you blackmail the West? With creating another conflict. And by the way, so you need to understand that Putin the West was slow in reaction regarding Russian aggression in Ukraine. But the Western reaction to what happened in Syria, in Aleppo, was also a sign for people. I can continue. The West is weak. You are not united. You will not be able to organize sanctions. I will use my propaganda. I have Le Pen. I have other people, you know. So I will deal with this. He made wrong understanding of it. Luckily, finally, the West reacted. But again, if you see reaction of the West, it's step by step.
Another question at the back, and I see now two over here.
Hi, I'm Eero, I'm Estonian, and I'm also studying international security. So my question is regarding sort of to get an Ukrainian perspective on Russian civil society, especially Russian civil society that is now in Europe. Because as far as I know, there haven't been many protests, for example, organized by the Russians in front of Russian embassies in European capitals, and at the same time we see ethnic tensions, especially in Germany, with Ukrainian migrants being treated poorly by Russians who are here on visas, etc. So I just wanted to get your perspective on the potential for visa ban and sort of how to treat the Russian civil society in general in Europe at this point. Thank you.
How to treat it in Europe? Look, first of all, as I have said, we Ukrainians, we are disappointed by, in general, reaction of the Russian public to aggression in Ukraine. There are people in Russia who are protesting and who were protesting since 2004. Unfortunately, this is weak. If people will come like in Maidan, many thousands, but Russian civil society is weak. There are some Russians who are against the war, they are vocal, we do appreciate it, but we still believe, we're saying to Russians, if you want to help Ukraine, try to change your country. It's easy to emigrate and to say, well, I'm for peace. It's very often you may hear, what is your attitude to what happened in Ukraine? No, we are for peace. We do not engage in politics. So regarding the bans, yes, there are the bans, and I think, look, it's not only about Putin. Putin is not the only person who is responsible for the war. Russian society is also responsible for the war. That's the reality. What would be the reaction here? We know that some countries introduced the bans, not full bans, by the way, because it's possible, to cross the border for humanitarian reasons or for political reasons. If you're part of opposition, you're persecuted. But not all countries, so we know that now there are changes also regarding Schengen visas. So I think this is right approach. And what we are saying in Ukraine, it's not normal when Russia is bombing Ukraine, killing civilians, and at the same time many Russians are enjoying a good life in Europe. They behave in such a way that nothing is happening. We're happy here in Europe to live. We do not express our attitude towards war. So yeah, I think that we are all of us, Europeans and Ukrainians, are in moral position to demand from Russians, behave, do something. By the way, if do you know the story of the Pink Floyd? The reaction to, No? Okay, so what remained of Pink Floyd, Sriga,
You talked about Roger Waters and what he said about...
But first of all, I would like to praise three other Pink Floyds, who sang together a song and made the release, the first release official Pink Floyd released for recent 15 years, so they were singing Ukrainian national song. It was very, very powerful, together with Ukrainian singers. So, and we do appreciate it. But Roger Waters, yes, his views pacifist, and we know it, good musicians, but politically, he is continuing to talk about Russian narratives. And there were protests in Poland recently, and he had to cancel his tour. Well done, Poles.
Please grab me with the top, the back, and then after we'll go below that.
Hello, my name is Emilie. I'm from France. I study governance and diplomacy here. Quick question about the perception in Ukraine of Turkey. So Turkey has been heavily involved, of course, in the negotiations. And what is the perception from Ukrainians on this?
Okay, thank you. Teşekkür ederim. In Turkish. Look, Turkey supplied Bayraktars, drones, which were very effective during the first days of the war. And, there were two popular names which Ukrainians started to give to their born children. One name is Javelina, woman's name, and the other name is Bayraktar, a guy's name. Okay, so Ukrainians were very happy about this support by Bayraktars, by Turkey. Bayraktars from Turkey and javelins from the United States. But Turkish position is very specific, frankly speaking. They are selling Bayraktars to us, and in some cases they're even giving it for free. Bayraktar is a private company. So the head of the company, his name is Bayraktar, it's family name. He is, how to say it, zять, son-in-law of Turkish President Erdogan. So this is good. On the other hand, Turkey didn't join economic sanctions. They even increased the trade. So it's a balancing policy, and Erdogan is saying things like, I respect Zelensky, I respect Putin, I would like to talk to everybody. So he's trying to play the role of mediator in grain deal, in exchange of prisoners. He played very important role. So basically he would like to increase his prestige and influence, showing that Turkey is a mediator, an effective mediator, and there are presidential elections in Turkey. Turkish economy is in very, very bad shape, but Erdogan would like to represent himself as a strong player and very effective player. So that's what he's doing. So we are not very happy about all of things which are connected to Turkish policy, but as a mediator, Erdogan is doing something which is important. We would be more happy if Turkey will join sanctions, definitely not. Oh, it's very important also, that Crimean Tatars, they are very close to Turks. So basically, there's almost no differences in language. So again, the position of Turkey is they didn't recognize annexation of Crimea, they are supporting Crimean Tatars, they are participating in different deals connected to the exchange of prisoners, including Crimean Tatars. But still there's a lot of Crimean Tatars in Russian prisons. Okay, look how Turkey voted in green. Okay. But still, we understand that it's not full support of Ukraine. In some cases, look, for example, Kazakhstan didn't abstain, okay? But actually, I would consider it as a victory for Ukraine, because you can imagine what is the pressure on Kazakhstan, right? Huge Russian pressure on Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries, but they decided to to abstain, not to follow Russia. Even Venezuela, those countries which Cuba didn't support Russia. So it's total isolation, I would say.
Next question down here.
Thank you, and I'm Jarvis from Hong Kong, not really on the map.
Ni hao.
Not really ni hao, there's Mandarin. We are speaking Cantonese, so it's different.
Mgoy sai.
That's thank you.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. So basically, two questions, and Putin acknowledged that China had questions and concern in the meeting with President Xi Jinping, should be last week, in Mongolia. And what's your view to this acknowledgement? Since do you think that it is the biggest failure of Russia's diplomacy during this war? And this is the first question. And the second question is, what's your view towards the role of China in this war? Since China, at the same time, in one hand, she's buying the gas and other Russian products, which eventually help Russia's economy from the Western sanctions. But on the other hand, China didn't really issue any statement to support this war, or even the yellow should be they absent from the voting. Do you think? And at the same time, is China kind of criticizing Russia didn't fulfill the responsibility of being a great power in the world, and at the same time creating chaos and bringing instability to the world. What's your view to Chinese role?
Okay, but what was the question regarding Mongolia? So Xi visited Mongolia?
Putin acknowledged that China had questions and concern about the war.
Yeah, I remember, yeah. Yeah, it was during the meeting of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so in Samarkand, in Uzbekistan. Okay, look, in 2014, after annexation of Crimea and the start of the war, one Russian analyst, Dmitry Trenin, who now is fully supporting aggression, but at that time he wrote an article with a very interesting title. The title was China's Victory in Ukraine in 2014. Why? Because Putin started aggression, Western sanctions, Russia appears in an isolation where Russia can turn to China. And Russia is transformed actually into the younger ally of China. So it's not the same as it was during, Soviet-Chinese friendship in 50s, when China was considered the younger brother. Now it's vice versa. Russia remains nuclear superpower, but economically and politically it's weaker than China, and China is benefiting from it. China is benefiting from it economically. So now, at the same time, official Chinese position since 2014 was always the same. The China respects territorial integrity, and we know reasons for that. So China didn't recognize annexation of Crimea. China withdrew all Chinese investment from Crimea, but at the same time China promoted cooperation with Russia in military sphere, in economic sphere. So what happened on the eve of full-scale war? Putin visited Xi. They signed a declaration, and in this declaration it was, the friendship was called Friendship Without Any Limits. Without any limits. So Putin waited for the end of the Olympic Games in Beijing and started aggression. In the same way as in 2014, Putin was waiting for the end of Olympic Games in Sochi, in Russia, and also started aggression. So it happened, so aggression started 3-5 days after the end of Olympics in China. Do you believe that they discussed the future of Ukraine during their meeting? Did Putin say anything to Chinese leader? I believe it was said. I think at least Putin informed China of what he is going to do. And different variants. Many analysts, not only in the West, but definitely in Russia, they believe that Ukraine will collapse in 2-3 days. And I believe in China, they also believe that Ukraine will collapse. If it happens, what would be the reaction? The West would strongly denounce, maybe some additional sanctions, but basically nothing substantial. It didn't happen. If it happens, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, it will give the green light to China to start aggression against Taiwan, definitely. So, because what happened in Kabul, the West was weak, and Putin read it, okay, I can continue with Ukraine. I remember the titles on Indian TV. Kabul fell, Kyiv next. Kyiv is encircled on the first day of Ukraine. Kyiv is encircled, everything is done on Indian TV. So basically, many expected that the same would happen in Kyiv. And if it happens again, China would have a green light. It didn't happen. The West demonstrated that this is strong. The West is strong. The West reacted to Russian aggression in Ukraine, and this is a sign that the West would react to Chinese aggression over Taiwan. So I think this is a very important conclusion. Regarding Chinese approach, again, it's if you follow Chinese propaganda, it repeats Russian narratives. It repeats Russian narratives throughout the world. But officially, China remains neutral, and they think the more Russian defeats in Ukraine, the less would be Chinese support to Russia. China is also afraid of the so-called, secondary sanctions against Chinese companies. So, again, I think, but China will definitely benefit from the weakness of Russia, as well.
Other questions? Good. We've got 1, 2, 3. We'll take all 3. We've got about 10 minutes. Maybe we'll take all 3 together. Do you mind to take it together? We'll take 3 questions.
Fine.
Take the 3 together, and we'll see it. We're almost at the end. We'll get them all.
I will be happy to answer more questions. It depends on your skill.
We also have a room thing that
another. Okay.
I think we can take these 3.
So thank you for being here today. And I'm Trudy, I'm from China. And so the question I want to ask is related to the religion. Because from what I understand, the spiritual structure of the Messiah is an important aspect of Russian culture. And so the Russian nations in their consciousness, like Russians to believe that they were unique in the world system, and they were a spiritual power with their mission to save humanity and represent the future and direction of the world. So in its foreign policy, this mentality is reflected in Russia's high level of concern for its own interest, which is almost exclusive, and in its tendency towards a great Russianism. So I want to know from your perspective. So how do you see the religious factor playing a part in the Russian invasion, or also in the reaction of Russian social society to the invasion? Thank you.
We'll take the other 2 questions as well.
Thank you so much. I'm Guido from Italy. Question that comes out of curiosity, because in the West, and especially, for example, in my country, we have some parts of the society, some parties that are really resilient in supplying Ukraine with military or political support and so on. But still, given this resistance, I still think that the West has given a quite united support to Ukraine. I think that the West is doing a good job, and I hope that it will go on in this way. But my question is, in Ukraine, what is the attitude of people, of leadership towards the West, if there are some sentiments of if there is a perception of a divided West, or whether this is a perception of a united West, and what is generally the attitude towards, for example, European countries, if it is different from the attitude to NATO, and so on. Thank you so much.
And then the third.
Hello, my name is Ben. I'm from Canada. My question actually is more about what you spoke about your personal experience dealing with propaganda under the Soviet Union. And we actually had a talk here last week from Vladimir Milov, who's a Russian opposition member, and he mentioned and asked why people weren't protesting more into the war and to other problems in Russia. He said it's a combination of fear of the consequences of dissent, which are severe in Russia, and also just propaganda. So from your personal experience, what does it take for people or individuals to overcome kind of the fear of the consequences of dissent and also propaganda?
I have also a question. Can I squeeze in?
Do you want to grab the mic? Tap on Mohyla.
So my question would be more about Ukrainian nation. Someone said that we hate Russians, but I think it's more that the pain, the deep-rooted pain we have as a generation, especially as my grandparents were affected by Russia, my grandparents were affected by Russia, my parents and me are affected by Russia, and I probably think my kids will also be affected by Russian. And do you think there is hope that this trauma and pain we will somehow overcome it in future? Of course, there should be and there will be peaceful coexistence, because we unfortunately share the border, but as a nation, how do you think, will it strengthen us or it will divide us and we will probably be in pain for too long more?
Okay, yeah, дуже дякую. Propaganda. That's the easiest answer for me because I do not know. I'm not a Russian, so it's difficult for me to judge. I'm not insider, in Russia. It's difficult for me to understand what works. But look, what I would like to stress here is you have different political culture of Russians and Ukrainians. The political culture is different. Actually, what is important to remember is that we are fighting in Ukraine not only for our independence, not only for our territorial integrity, we are fighting for democracy. I have here slides which shows that Ukrainians are supported democracy over authoritarianism, but it will take some more time to discuss, but there are figures that Ukrainians strongly believe in democracy, and this is very, very important. This is different from Russia. So again, it's fight for democracy, it's fight against authoritarianism. For Russia, yes, I think it's a combination, but combination of different factors. But I will leave it to Russians. Okay, we Ukrainians, when we are attacked, when we see falsification of the elections, when we see pressure of the government, we go to Maidan and we sacrifice our lives, like it happened in Maidan when there were killings of Ukrainians, but it didn't stop Ukrainians. Regarding future relations with Russia, well, at this point, look, there were many normalizations in Europe after World War II. Germany, France, Germany, Poland, but it happened after Germans actually take the responsibility for what they did. Now there is a normalization of relations between Poland and Ukraine for decades, despite the historic grievances. So both nations overcame it. But so, in theory, there could be normalization of relations sometime in the future, but it's necessary that Russia will recognize that we are separate, we have separate identity, we have our rights, we have the right to choose where we would like to be, and also Russians need to take responsibility for the crimes they did in Ukraine and cease to be imperialistic in Ukrainian approach to Ukraine. Because, for example, if we have now a ceasefire, but the basic attitudes of Russian elites, of Russians, remains the same, then there would be inevitably new war in the future. So it's necessary to have profound changes within Russia. And again, so it depends on Russians, not on us, what would be the future of relations with Ukraine. Regarding religion, look, what you were saying actually, it's not only about religion, it's in general, Russian approach to the world. This is about also political culture. Russian political culture is messianic, which means we can be poor, but we will lead the world to the bright future. We may be poor, but we have enough nuclear arms to destroy you tens of times, and so on and so forth. We will lead the world to the bright future. This was Dostoevsky's approach, by the way. Catholicism is bad, Orthodoxy is right, Poles are bad. So, and this is part of the Russian world ideology. So the ideology of Russian world is that we are unique. Okay, fine if you are unique, but do not impose it on others. Orthodoxy is Russia, is very official, so it's totally subordinated to the Tsar. Now Putin, because previously, again, Russian church was subordinated to Tsar, basically. So it's kind of official religion, but this is also a problem, because you have a lot of Muslims, a lot of Buddhists in Russia. So again, what happened after February 24th? The ideology of Ruski Mir, of Russian world, actually showed its aggressiveness and its anti-human approach. And this is for Russians to draw lessons, but also for the West, because it's impossible to live with Russia in its present form. Reaction to the West. To the West right now, look, we are grateful for everything the West is doing for us. Not only the West, by the way. Taiwan is sending humanitarian support to Ukraine. Other countries are sending some support to Ukraine. But at the same time, we are very disturbed and we are criticizing some of Western countries, some of the politicians, where they do not provide support to Ukraine, when they try to find excuses. So I believe no excuse that the West is not supplying anti-missile system in Ukraine. It's still alarm in Kyiv. No, air alarm in Kyiv. So, we are definitely frustrated by what Hungary is doing, but we are differentiating between Hungary and Hungarian civil society, because civil society is providing a lot of support. We see what are the positive changes in the position of Western government. So changes in the French position, changes in German position. We criticized Germany for years, because Russian aggression started in 2014. In 2015, they started Nord Stream 2. Come on, guys, what are you doing? But now, this is dramatic change in the German position. Slow, but there is a change. So again, the attitude of Ukrainians, 90% of Ukrainians would like to join the European Union. So this is clear. About 80% are in favor of joining NATO. Support to those countries, the good attitude to those countries which are supporting Ukraine is skyrocketing. There are more reservations about some other countries. Luckily, they are not numerous. So I will stop here. And again, I would like to thank you for your interest. I would like also to thank you for your support. Please support Ukraine, Ukrainian people. You can do it in your own way. Spread the word of truth. You may support by humanitarian things. So do not forget that we are Europeans, and in the center of Europe you have a bloody war. So, and this support would be very much appreciated by Ukrainians.
Professor Olexiy Haran, thank you so much.
Thank you again to you and to joint project.
Absolutely, joint project.
Yes.